I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Support for Ben Franklin's World comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. The Omohundro Institute supports the study of early American history through its publications, conferences, fellowships, and programming. The OI's goal is to promote excellence and innovation in early American scholarship and to increase awareness about that scholarship. Paul Sperry is a successful businessman who is a longtime supporter of the Omohundro Institute and a member of its executive board. Like us, Paul's someone who loves history, and he supports the OI's mission and its work because he believes that knowledge of the early American past is important to our present-day world.
The study of history is critically important, not only for good scholarship, but frankly for good citizenship, both as we look out as Americans and also as world citizens. Our life is rich and complex and varied and nuanced, and the best scholarship in history reflects all of that. And that's really where the Omohundro Institute shines, I think, through its William and Mary Quarterly, its book programs, its conferences. It really provides, I think, the best view we've got in terms of, early American history.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 114 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. In the last episode of the Doing History, How Historians Work series, we explored the world of professional genealogy. Because, like history, genealogy studies people, and it's a field of study that actually allows us to investigate our personal pasts. Today, we're going to follow up on that episode, which was episode 110, by exploring why it's important for us to recognize that the practices and processes of history and genealogy have histories. Because it's actually within those histories of history and genealogy that we can see how and why we study, view, and understand the past as we do. That's why in this episode, we're going to explore the history of genealogy in early America. Our guide for this exploration is Karen Wolf, a professor of history at the College of William and Mary and the director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. For many years now, Karen has been doing history, that is researching, writing, and thinking about the practice of genealogy in British North America. And today, she's going to share with us why early Americans were interested in genealogy and how they practiced it, information about early American and European institutions that encouraged early Americans' interest in family history, and why it's important for historians, genealogists, and anyone who loves history really to understand the history of genealogy. Ready to find out more about early Americans' interest in their family history? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of history at the College of William and Mary and the director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. She's the author of numerous articles centered on the social history of family, labor, and gender, and the author of the award-winning book, Not All Wives, Women of Colonial Philadelphia. Today, she joins us as part of our Doing History, How Historians Work series to discuss the history of genealogy and the role genealogy plays in history and historical research, with details from her book in progress, tentatively titled Lineage, Genealogy, Family History, and the Politics of Connection in British America, 1680 to 1820. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Karen Wolf.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And we're looking forward to this conversation too, Karen, because as the title of your book suggests, Americans have had a keen interest in genealogy since the 17th century. So, would you provide us with an overview of when and why early Americans became interested in genealogy?
Wow, it's really hard to talk about when they became interested in genealogy because I think part of the premise of my book is that genealogy is something that Americans, and by Americans, I guess I need to specify here that I'm looking at British America. So I'm interested in the British colonies in mainland North America, from Georgia to Maine. But I'm talking about all of the people who lived within that British American space. So some of those are British colonists, and some of those are African Americans and Native Americans and people from other European backgrounds. So when I say that Americans were kind of always interested in genealogy and always invested in genealogy, it makes it really hard to pick a starting point, as it were. My book looks at the period from 1680 to 1820, the long 18th century, and I'm arguing that over that period of time, we see not changes in the intensity of British American interest in genealogy, but some kinds of changes in the forms of expression and some kinds of changes in the ways that people were being asked to produce genealogy.
So it sounds like genealogy and interest in genealogy has been present just about since Europeans started settling British America.
Yeah, so historians are supposed to say that there are historically specific beginnings and endings, right? We're supposed to talk about change over time. And one of the challenges of this book is that I'm talking about something that's fairly constant. That is, you can look at pretty much any society at any point in time and find an interest in ancestry. Not absolutely every place and every time, but most. And what's astonishing is how consistent and how prevalent genealogy is as an interest. For me, what's important is explaining how British American interest in the 18th century is quite specific. It has a very specific kind of form and content. So it was really fun as I started working on this book a long time ago to look comparatively at how genealogy was practiced. For example, there's a wonderful historian at Harvard who's worked on genealogy in the Ming Dynasty in China and how that looks very specific. And there are historians who have more recently looked at the significance of genealogical practice in Spanish American colonial contexts. But British American genealogical interest is a quite specific form, and that's what I'm interested in.
Now, in Bible, King, and Common Law, which is an article Karen published in the fall 2012 edition of Early American Studies, an interdisciplinary journal, Karen noted that British Americans were fluent in 3 areas where knowing your genealogy seemed to be a must: religion, government, and law. So let's start with religion. Karen, what role did religion play in encouraging British Americans to become interested in genealogy?
In that article, which is part of the first chapter of the book, I'm arguing that religion, politics, and law are sort of the background cultural impulses for understanding genealogy in British America. And what I mean by that is that religion, politics, and law emphasize and, in fact, require in some important ways people to understand and to be able to articulate their genealogical connections. So if we start with religion, the religion I'm talking about here is Protestantism, which is the kind of authorized religious context for British Americans. The colonies are settled, as we know, by different kinds of Protestant groups. So there are Anglicans in the royal colonies of Virginia and the Carolinas, for example, whereas New England is settled by Puritans, and in the middle colonies we have a mix of Quakers and religious German Protestant groups. But among all of those groups, there's a common Protestant background. Protestantism, like all of Christianity, is fundamentally genealogical. If we think about the Old Testament and the New Testament, these are really genealogical documents. It's a little bit of a canard that the Old Testament is a lot about who begat whom, but it is. Those Old Testament genealogies are very, very important to explaining the origins of biblical peoples. And in the New Testament, explaining Jesus' genealogy, explaining his descent from the house of David is extremely important. So religion, in the sense that the Bible is a genealogical document that emphasizes the significance of family connections, is one point. But the other, I think, is that religious organization in British America really emphasizes the importance of family connection. Parishes and church congregations keep track of and emphasize birth relationships, marriage relationships, and so on.
Yeah. In your article, you mentioned that British Americans really wanted their ministers to keep track of family histories within their congregations. Was it because genealogy was so important in the Bible, or were there other reasons for that desire?
I think it's interesting that there's a combination here. That is that, yes, the Bible really emphasizes genealogical relationships, but also then it is the case that as a social function, churches take on the business of keeping track of who's related to whom. And in fact, in some ways, these are quasi kind of governmental responsibilities. So in England, parishes are responsible for keeping track of family relationships, who is born where and who their mother and father is, in part to understand who could be eligible for parish-wide benefits. If somebody becomes poor, indigent, the parish is responsible for some form of care for them. And there's a bit of that carries over, although there's some variation in the colonies, but there's a bit of that carries over, that sense of a kind of social, quasi-governmental responsibility for care that's inherent in the record keeping that congregations do. And again, there's variety. I mean, British America is a quite diverse place. Structurally, local governments are very different in South Carolina than they are in New York, for example, or in Massachusetts. But this kind of basic sense that churches need to keep track of who is born and who is married and who dies is quite consistent.
What did these early American genealogical and parish records look like? Were they uniform, or did each parish have their own style of record keeping?
Golly, wouldn't it be great if they were uniform? I know genealogists wish that was the case, because the information that people in the 21st century seeking information about the past require would be made much easier if these records were simply kept in the same form and consistently, but they weren't. So here's a kind of typical situation. We'll start with New England because that's actually the most uniform case. A minister in New England would be responsible for keeping track of the births, marriages, and deaths within his congregation, and he would be charged by the organization, the hierarchy of that congregation, with keeping a record book that would account for all of that. And if he did a good job, that was great. And often he would get requests from people. I have correspondence showing that congregants would write to the minister and say, I'm checking on the marriage date of my grandparents. Could you let me know when that happened? Could you check? Sometimes they can and sometimes they can't. If they do a good job, that's great. If they don't do a good job, they can be taken to task for it. And the congregation, whether it's a vestry, as it would be in the Anglican Church in Virginia, or whether it's a parish council in a congregation in New England, they might, kind of shake their finger, or they might actually even get rid of the minister or attempt to get rid of the minister for keeping poor records.
Now, just as Protestant denominations taught and emphasized the importance of genealogical knowledge, so did the British monarchy. Karen, what role did the British monarchy play in convincing early Americans that they should really know and study their genealogy?
Well, it's a little less direct than it sounds. It's not like, King George I is saying, all of my subjects, you must track your genealogy and report back to me. It's a little bit of a broader cultural understanding than that. It's not the monarchy itself, really, that requires people to track their genealogy. It's the fact of the monarchy and the particular succession form in England. So I think one of my challenges is showing how British American cultural organization is specific. It's not normal, neutral, natural. It doesn't evolve in a way that doesn't require explanation. It's quite specific, actually. And the rules of British monarchical succession are lineal. That is, there's lineal descent, and it's for a preference of male heirs, although not always exclusively male heirs. And that actually the laws of succession change over time. But what is constant is that in the English monarchy, there's a great deal of focus on who's related to whom and thus who can inherit the throne. And if you think about just the period that I'm looking at, the long 18th century, there was a fairly significant shift. Let's not even go to the Tudor Stuarts or before that, the Wars of the Roses or something like that. But there's still a fairly important transition in the family that is ruling England in the long 18th century. That shift from the restored Stuarts in the late 17th century to the Glorious Revolution and the rule of William and Mary, and then Queen Anne, and then a wholesale transition to the House of Hanover with George I. Now, all of that makes people really attuned to how someone is related to whom. The succession there in England is a quite complicated thing for people to keep track of. How would colonists have thought of the fact that the first George I, is the great-grandson of James I, for heaven's sake? That's, 100 years prior. He's inheriting the throne of his great-grandfather. It's a pretty complicated set of family relationships. But there were some kinds of sources that emphasized for well, certainly for people who were very knowledgeable and educated, there were more extensive sources. But even almanacs, for example, which were among the most popular printed sources in British America, had information about the monarchs and about their relationship, their succession. It's really a popular feature, actually, of the almanacs, is to have little bits of information about the monarchy and about genealogical relationships among the monarchs. So your question, how did the monarchy sort of help people to understand the importance of genealogy? In a sense, it's really the kind of this cultural underpinning of the idea of monarchical succession through family relationships that is the kind of important point.
Did interest in the monarchy's line of succession encourage Britons in Great Britain and elsewhere in the British Atlantic world to develop an interest in genealogy similar to that of the British Americans?
Oh, that's a great question. I get that question a lot. That is, how specific is the interest of British colonists as compared to people in England, for example? I'll just stick with that example because there is an important, corollary question about other people in Europe and people in Africa and the Caribbean and other related areas around the Atlantic world. But just to stick with the question of people in England as opposed to in British America, it's not a subject of my research, but I have found terrific information in families that I've traced transatlantically. So, one example is an extensive Philadelphia family, the Logans, the Norrises, very prominent merchants and politicians in Philadelphia. And I had done a lot of work on their genealogical research in the early and mid 18th century. They were super interested in who was related to whom, as actually all Quakers were. Genealogy is a really important component of Quaker practice, although I don't think they would have phrased it that way. It's my characterization of it as genealogy, but they really kept track of family relationships very, very carefully. Anyway, I'd done a lot of work on that family, and they're in the middle colonies, especially in Philadelphia, but also in New Jersey. And then just last year, I went and worked on the English side of the family and was able to pick up on the correspondence, the transatlantic correspondence, showing that the English side of the family was doing very similar things. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest to know that there was the same kind of phenomena taking place in England, although I'm sure that there are some kind of specific cultural, local, regional forms in England, just as there were in British America.
Michael notes that Americans in our present day, as well as in our early American past, just seem really fascinated with royal blood and the ability to trace families back to members of European royalty and nobility. And he's curious whether this fascination ever stopped or lessened with the American Revolution, and if so, when that fascination resurfaced in modern-day American genealogy.
Gosh, I hope this isn't an unsatisfying answer. Historians are supposed to be able to say, here's when this specific thing happened, and that it's really specific to a particular moment in time. I think that American interest in royal families is not a new phenomenon, and it didn't sort of begin. I guess one of the first questions you asked me was, when did early American interest in genealogy start? And I said, well, it actually doesn't begin. It's just inherent, and it exists long before my period. What I'm trying to show is its kind of specific forms in the long 18th century. And I think I would answer that question about an interest in royal lineages in the same way. There is no beginning to an interest in royal lineages. It's a long-standing interest, and it doesn't end and then begin again in the modern period. It has a different kind of inflection. The 19th century isn't my period, but Americans were awfully interested in Victoria and in Victoria's family and in the kind of activities and the family relationships among her children and so on. So maybe one characterization would be colonial British Americans were very interested in the family of George III, and then let's skip over to Princess Diana or something like that. It's really not that way. It's a quite consistent interest. It just may take a different form or intensity at different periods of time. Again, the sources that I've used for the 18th century include visual and material culture showing an interest in the monarchs, and print culture that would have been accessed by ordinary people, including the almanacs, which show a lot of interest in royal relationships, magazines, which have biographies of royal people and nobility, which show this strong interest. As for Michael's question about whether that interest kind of waned after the American Revolution, it didn't if we measure the print culture. The same kinds of biographical information that was in the magazines in the 18th century is still showing up in the late 18th and early 19th century in the post-revolutionary period. It's actually a really fascinating and intense conversation in the 1780s and 1790s about not just the fact that aristocracy seemed to be on the decline in the wake of the Age of Revolutions, but that what was the nature of aristocracy, what were aristocrats about, There were some particularly louche and badly behaved aristocrats in England, as well as on the continent, that got a great deal of attention and attracted a lot of criticism. But there really is no kind of sharp waning of interest in royal families and royal lineages.
We've talked about the Bible. We've talked about the king. Now let's talk about common law. Karen, would you tell us about English common law and how it further entrenched the notion that British Americans really should care about their genealogy?
So common law is, different from statute law. Common law is the law that judges make on the basis of precedent, stare decisis, decisions that have come before. So common law is based on principle. And in England, and then for the transfer of English common law to the British colonies and then to the new United States, very much about property and about relationships of property. I don't want to say that American property law, either in the colonial period or in the New Republic, was undifferentiated. There was some variation, actually pretty important variation. But again, if we look to the commonalities, what's common is an emphasis on inheritance through lineal family relationships. That is, the assumption is that property will be inherited by children and then grandchildren and so on. The law, both in England, but more importantly, even within the many variations in British America, there are regional and colony and then state differences, allows for the fact that just like in the English monarchy, there will not always be a son to inherit. There will not always then be a daughter to inherit by default, that one has to reckon family relationships, sometimes to second and third degrees. What's interesting is that if you look at some of the legal literature in the 18th century that's circulating around British America, it emphasizes how important it is for lawyers and clerks and other kinds of lower level legal functionaries, how important it is for them to understand genealogical relationships when they're helping their clients to settle estates. There are wonderful illustrations that are teaching officers of the court about what it means for someone to inherit the property of their great uncle or their third cousin or whatever. There's a very strong emphasis in the law on genealogical relationships. So that's one dimension, the law of property. And if we think about it in a really simple way, we're talking about property that is land or goods that will descend in a family when someone dies. Of course, for most people in British America, they don't have any property to descend, but sometimes they do, even if it's a very small amount. And many people did not make wills. So it's interesting for us to look at what the intestate laws are. That is, what do you do if there's very little property and the person didn't leave a will? And those intestate laws also emphasize how important genealogical relationships are for determining who should get what. Another thing that's important to understand is that property law and a lot of other family law in Britain and in British America is premised on patrilineal relationships, that is, relationships that descend through the father's line. And that, too, is very strongly biblical, and it's very strongly there in the monarchy. That is, there's a presumption of patrilineal descent. But as we know, that doesn't always work out, and so there's a way that the monarchy has to be accommodated to an absence of sons or whatever. The one strong exception to this rule, which will not surprise any of your listeners, is in the law of slavery, where the status of slavery comes from a mother status. So that means that when the mother is enslaved, the children will be enslaved. There's very powerful work on this subject, and I know you've had a fantastic show with Jennifer Morgan talking about the work of reproduction in slavery and the significance of enslaved women to the system of slavery in the Atlantic world. But that's a really important point when it comes to how the law emphasizes the significance of genealogical relationships, because slavery depends on slave mothers, essentially, in a really cruel way. I can talk more a little bit about how the law of slavery works and how it works to emphasize genealogy, but you might want to save that for another question.
The ways in which the institution of slavery used and valued genealogy and genealogical information was really one of the most fascinating parts of your research, and an aspect that perhaps many of us don't even think about. So maybe you could talk to us a bit about how genealogy and genealogical information were used in practices of slavery.
Genealogy is fundamental to the function of slavery in the Atlantic world. And this is one of the most important points, I think, of the book that I'm trying to write. And as you will have seen, as you so graciously read many of these draft chapters, it's present pretty much throughout. Genealogy is fundamental to slavery in that the status of slavery comes from the mother status. But that means that for both people who claim to own other people as slaves, but also for people who are enslaved, understanding genealogical relationships is critical. This works in two dimensions. So slave holders keep careful track of genealogical relationships among the people that they are enslaving. And the people who are enslaved are also keeping track of their relationships for a variety of reasons. I think the most productive tension in this book that I'm working on is the way that individual people feel intimately and powerfully about the relationships they have with their family members, but also that institutions of power, whether we're talking about the law or talking about the government, that is monarchy or religion, institutions of power are also deeply invested in genealogical relationships. And it's the tension between those two, how individuals and families represent their relationships and how institutions of power keep track of those relationships and require information about those relationships in order to reproduce power, essentially. So for enslaved people, one key way of arguing for freedom, and it is a minority of people who are able to do this, but nonetheless it's extremely important. One way of acquiring freedom is to argue on the basis of the freedom of their mother. So we see in the majority of freedom suits, now, again, I would say it's tricky to quantify this, but in the majority of the freedom suits that I've looked at, the argument for freedom is based on the status of the mother and genealogical relationships that are recounted in the court records through either an oral history or in some cases through records that are referred to in the court documents. So, for example, in the 1730s, there's this woman, Martha Thompson, in Westmoreland County in Virginia, who goes to court saying that she's being held as a servant against the terms of her indenture. This is not uncommon. She's not a slave, but she's being held as a servant because her parents had bound her out, not able to provide care for her. Her mother was a mixed-race woman, and in Virginia in the 1730s, it's not uncommon that a mixed-race mother and father would not have the financial means to take care of all of their children, so they bind them out as servants to provide for their care. And the usual term of service is about 21 years. Thompson goes to court saying, look, I'm being held as a servant beyond that. My mother was free. I should be freed at this point. And that's not an uncommon kind of point in freedom suits, that someone argues that their parent is free and thus they should not be held either as a slave or as a servant beyond a particular term.
Much of our discussion has centered on how white British Americans use genealogy, but British America was really a diverse place that included free and enslaved Africans and African Americans, and free and enslaved Native American peoples too. So did members of these groups share white British Americans' interest in genealogy?
They did, and again, for a combination of reasons. One would be that most cultures have some way of valuing family connections, but it may not be in the same kind of lineal way that British American culture values family relationships. But it is true that British American culture requires people to be attentive to family relationships in this lineal style, in part because of property. So, for example, even if Native American people may have, in different kinds of cultural situations, valued family relations that were lateral, for example, that is across siblings and cousins rather than lineal, that is descending to children, grandchildren, and so on, in some contexts, for reasons of property and access to kinds of property that British law was protecting, they may have had to reckon relationships lineally. So one example that I have is of an account book, which is a not uncommon place for people to keep track of family relationships. Is a Native American man in the early 18th century who had an account book where he's living in Massachusetts in the early 18th century, and he's been paid as a servant some wages, and he's tracking those in an account book, as well as his own children's births. Other kinds of examples of that kind, of one cultural group accommodating to British American style genealogical information. The Dutch, too, for example, a group that you know very well. Among the Dutch, property law does not necessarily work in the same patrilineal way that it does in British America. In the Dutch case, marital property, when men and women marry, their property does not then all collect and then descend to their children necessarily. That property can go back to the wife's family. But in a British American context, they may adapt their genealogical practices to reflect a more British American style of patrilineal genealogy.
Now that we've had an overview of how British Americans use genealogy, let's explore how they created or did genealogy. In episode 110, which was our last installment of the Doing History series, professional genealogist Joshua Taylor told us how genealogists in our present day research ancestry. They start with the present generation of their family and work their way back through the past. They visit physical and internet archives to find information in census records, account books, and civil records. And sometimes they submit DNA samples to make genetic connections. Karen, if this is how we work in the present, how did early Americans go about researching their ancestry in the past?
Well, could I start with the example again of the kind of non-British, non-white, unfree people who were recounting genealogies? Because I think that's really important. It is really significant, I think, that enslaved people, when they went to court to argue for their freedom, were able to bring to bear all kinds of information about their family relationships. And often this was oral testimony, but it did sometimes recur to specific records as well. So the kinds of records that slave owners were keeping about family relationships among enslaved people could be brought into court testimony. And what's interesting is that enslaved people know of those records and call on them. It's also interesting that in contested cases of manumission, new records are created that generate information about family relationships among unfree people. One great example is the kind of extraordinary case of the will of John Pleasant, a Virginian Quaker who drafted a will in 1771. Now, this was before Virginia had passed a manumission law in 1782, allowing people to privately manumit enslaved people without the benefit of an act of the legislature. And when John Pleasant died, his enslaved people were not freed automatically. But later, because of that manumission law, his descendants argued that some of those people should have gone free. And what's interesting, I guess, is that some of John Pleasant's descendants absolutely wanted to act on the intent of his will, which was to free all of these people, and others of his descendants continued to enslave people. So there's an extraordinary set of court cases, and then this goes on through the late 1790s and into the early 19th century. And in the course of these cases, there is information generated by lawyers on both sides about family relationships among these enslaved people. And then some of these enslaved people are able to then use that information that's generated to recur back to it in subsequent cases, arguing for freedom when they hadn't gained it during the original case. So that's a situation there where you see information that is fundamentally genealogical, but it's not the kind of private family production that we're accustomed to thinking of as genealogy. But it is really important genealogy, and it reflects deep knowledge on the part of all the people concerned. To me, that's genealogy in action, and that's exceptionally important. There are also lots of other ways that early Americans were keeping genealogical information. They would produce all kinds of artifacts of genealogical importance. There's needlepoint. There are kinds of mementos that carry genealogical significance that would be passed down from one generation to another. There are images that become genealogical artifacts and have significance, but there are also lots of written records that people kept, sometimes little family record books. Sometimes they would write genealogical information in the history of their family within other texts, sometimes in Bibles, although that's really a kind of much later and 19th century practice. There are some examples, some important examples of family histories within Bibles in the 18th century, but it's not the predominant place. I love the fact that I can go to a group of 18th century account books and very often find within an account book that's keeping track of someone's work as a shoemaker or a brick maker or a tailor. And I can find at least a page or two where there is family history written, information about births and deaths and marriages, even details of illnesses, sometimes prose accounts of the family's travels or the different places of settlement. So there are lots and lots of different places where people were keeping genealogies.
Did they keep genealogies and any oral histories too?
They did, and oral histories are incredibly important, the ways that people passed information orally. Now, what's interesting, of course, about these oral histories is that the evidence we have of those oral family histories is in subsequent texts. So a lot of the work I've done is what I call a kind of archaeology of genealogy, where I've looked at a lot of early 19th century local histories, where antiquarians were doing histories where they would write down information that came from older members of their town or from someone in town who had a family history that they allowed them to copy down. So there's a kind of transmission of information by antiquarians and local historians that then lets us see what the oral history of families was.
You noted that you enjoy opening account books and finding a page or two with genealogical information written on them. And I wonder if you would tell us how early Americans wrote up their genealogical research.
Well, there are lots of different ways that they work on their genealogies and then account for it. I've given you a couple of examples. court cases, for example, reflect genealogical research. That is, when someone goes to court to sue for their freedom on the basis of ancestry and they recount, my mother or my grandmother was a free woman, that actually is a reflection of genealogical research. They have gone to find out that information and to get corroborating evidence of that information. That reflects genealogical research. But there are more elaborate examples, textual examples, where I find that people have kept either in manuscript or very, very rarely in a printed form. There are just a tiny handful of printed family histories from the 18th century, but in manuscript form where someone will show how they have gotten information from an ancestor. Benjamin Franklin is a great example of this, actually, and even better is Benjamin Franklin and his sister, Jane Meekum. They each kept genealogical information, albeit in different form. Jill Lepore's wonderful book on Jane Meekum that shows her book of ages, and she kept information about her children and about her husband's family and so on. Benjamin Franklin, as we know, his famous autobiography begins right away with a kind of account of a genealogical research trip that he took with his son William in England. But Benjamin Franklin also had the benefit of an uncle, also Benjamin, who was interested in genealogy and had been collecting genealogical information from the Franklin family and kept records and passed those along to Benjamin Franklin, who then wrote up some of it he didn't. So those are a couple of examples of how people would collect information from their relatives, write it down, sometimes, as in the Franklin case, in prose form that we now still have. Some of that in research notes, which are not published, are still adrift in archives or special collections libraries, and a lot of which I'm sure is still in the hands of families.
We've been talking a lot about the different ways that early Americans kept and tracked their genealogy. And Matthew notes that many genealogists have silos of unique information right in their homes, journals, diaries, and objects, which have been passed down from one generation to the next. For example, he notes that members of his Sons of the American Revolution and Society of the Cincinnati organizations actually own swords, muskets, journals, and other household items from the period of the American Revolution. And he notes that all of these objects have value as historical sources, as does all that family lore that's been passed along with them. So Matthew would really like to know how historians can make use of the objects and oral histories in genealogists' hands to better understand historical peoples, places, and events.
So I really love that question, and I want to thank Matthew for it. And I guess my response to it is sort of embedded in the question itself. That is that Matthew already highlights that the object evokes genealogy in that it refers to the original owner or producer of the object, whether it's a sword or whether it's a journal or something. But it also helps you to think about relationships over time in terms of how that object was passed down. And I'm interested in both of those dimensions, in part because I think genealogies are, a kind of a construction. They are a way that we think about a relationship among family members over time. And although, as we've been talking about in the British American context, there's a very strong emphasis on patrilineal relationships, that is, through a father's line, so a very kind of male-oriented genealogical relationship. It's not always possible, as we've also talked about in the monarchical case or in other cases. There are lots of ways in which relationships move laterally or along a female line. And genealogical objects are particularly interesting in the way that they move from one generation to the next and not always descending perfectly. I use an example in the article, at least in memory. I use an object that is a Bible that was passed down from one generation of men named Timothy to the next generation. As long as there was a boy named Timothy, he got this Bible. But what's interesting about it is that tradition, and this isn't a 17th century Bible, but it's an early 18th century genealogical inheritance. But that tradition of this Bible passing from one Timothy to the next was actually started by a woman who wanted boys in this family named after her father. So that's a very interesting way in which a kind of woman intervenes in that patrilineal succession. And there are other kinds of objects that carry those kinds of other, that is, non-patrilineal relationships. So I think, Matthew's point about the object itself is owned by someone who's interesting to research, but the way the object descends is itself a really interesting artifact of genealogical consciousness and relationships. And I think historians can do a lot with that. And I've been really fascinated by how that worked in the 18th century. And I think historians can be much more attentive to how that worked in any kind of place or time.
Karen, you're still doing history in that you're still in the process of writing your history of genealogical knowledge and practice in British North America. Has your research led you to any discoveries about how historians and genealogists can use knowledge about genealogical practices, and that's in the past and in the present, to further their historical and genealogical research?
Absolutely. I have great respect for professional genealogists and for genealogists who work within a discipline that has its own kinds of rules. I think, as Josh Taylor referred to in the previous episode of Doing History, genealogists have a particular mode and method of work, just as historians have a particular mode and method of work. And I think it's important, for one thing, for each of us to understand how the other works and the ways in which we can actually learn from one another and appreciate the differences in those practices and some of the commonalities. The other thing I would say is that it's important for both genealogists and historians to think about the fact that genealogy has a history in the same way that history has a history. Each of these disciplinary practices comes really in formalized ways out of the 19th century, even though, as I'm documenting, there's long and extensive and rich evidence of genealogical work in the 18th century and long before. What we think of genealogy now and what we think of history now as a formal academic discipline comes out of the 19th century, and they come from a kind of shared place, a shared emphasis on evidence as important. They come from a shared interest in doing research and in documenting that research. So it's interesting, I guess, first of all, just to appreciate the differences, but also to understand the kind of shared origin, in a sense, of both genealogy and history.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Great Britain had been a democracy or a republic in the 17th century? How would the lack of a monarch who used genealogy to justify their right to power and authority have affected the adoption and performance of genealogy in British North America?
Wow, that's a really hard question to answer, because I think, as I've tried to show, the monarchy emphasizes succession and the importance of genealogy, in part because the monarchy is taking its cue from the Bible and its emphasis on genealogy, and genealogy as a legitimization of authority and power. And then English law is so wrapped up in that particular articulation of the relationship between genealogy, legitimacy, authority, that it's hard to kind of disentangle them. And I think that's one of the things that my book tries to do at the very end, is to talk about how, in the American context, in the very late 18th and early 19th century, how Americans try to grapple with untangling, essentially, those relationships. So what would genealogy have looked like if the monarchy didn't exist and if England had been a republic? I guess in some ways that's what we're looking at in the American context in the 19th century. What does genealogy look like? It becomes, I guess, framed as a private interest. So in England, you have not exactly a public, but an organization that is related to the monarchy and to the monarchical government, the College of Heralds, which is responsible for researching and then conveying publicly information about the genealogical relationships among the nobles and the aristocracy and the monarchy. Whereas in the United States in the early 19th century, you get the founding of private genealogical societies. So maybe one answer is that it becomes kind of more privatized interest, but it's hard to see how genealogy is not of interest. I think it's interesting to lots of people in lots of different kinds of governmental situations in lots of different cultures. So I think it doesn't go away per se, but maybe it becomes more of a privatized concern. And by that, I don't mean it's only an interest of families, but it's not an expressly articulated interest of the government. Except then I'm going to have to contradict myself here too and say that, as I've shown, the law makes the government really invested in genealogy. So the law would have to be framed differently too. And as we saw in the American case in the 19th century, the law of inheritance, in fact, doesn't change that dramatically. The law of inheritance does not say in the United States, for example, that families do not inherit property. They do. They continue to do in ways that are absolutely connected to the British tradition of succession and inheritance.
We've just had a behind-the-scenes look at your present research project. Is there any other projects that you're working on that you'd care to share with us?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to finish this book this year, not this year, 2016, where we're recording, but in 2017. And I've started a new project. I started it a couple of years ago that actually owes a great deal to the research I've done in the work of local historians and antiquarians in the 19th century. And I'm really interested in how the work that they were doing in the 19th century was picked up by 20th century historians, and the ways that 20th century understandings of the 18th century were framed by the 19th century. So that's a lot of time travel there. We could have talked about this in the time warp question, but it's about how the 20th century view of the 18th century is mediated by the 19th century. It's a lot of fun, and it lets me work in some of the same sources that I've really richly appreciated in the project on genealogy.
Where should we look for more information about you, and how we can contact you if we still have questions about early American genealogy?
I have a website, KarenWolf.com, and you can find information about me on the Omohundro website, and I tweet at KAWolf, and I'm easy to reach by email, kawolf@wm.edu, and I'd be very glad to hear from any of your listeners who are interested in the history of genealogy and the history of genealogical production.
Karen Wolf, thank you so much for taking us through the early American history and practice of genealogy, and why historians and genealogists should be aware that history and genealogy have histories.
Thanks so much, Liz. This has been a lot of fun.
Genealogy has a history, and part of that history reveals why Americans have long been interested in the history of their families. From Karen's descriptions, we could see that some American interest in genealogy is rooted in British common law, which powerfully encouraged early Americans to be interested in genealogy due to its reliance on genealogical knowledge to determine right of inheritance and condition of servitude. Likewise, churches also encouraged early Americans to maintain and generate knowledge of their lineage. Not only did the Bible tell early Americans that, hey, family history is important and worth knowing about, but ministers actively recorded vital statistics, births, deaths, and marriages, which is genealogical knowledge that communities used not just when they needed to prove someone's condition of servitude or the relation to a rich uncle who passed away, but also to determine who belonged to their community and who was entitled to receive some of their Christian charity if they ever fell on hard times. Now, as we've just discussed, the history of genealogy contains information about historic peoples and places, but that's only part of the information it contains. Understanding the history of genealogy also provides us with knowledge about how the practice of genealogy developed. It tells us how and why early family records look the way they do, and why genealogists look at court records, account books, family Bibles, and family heirlooms when they're searching for information about someone's personal past. Plus, it also helps us better understand how genealogists came to know what they know about the past. In short, knowing the history of genealogy reminds us that, just like history, genealogy is a process that is constructed and investigated through evidence and analysis. And it's important for us to understand this process and how it works because, just like history, genealogy contributes to our knowledge of who we are and how we came to be who we are. Look for more information about Karen and notes for today's episode on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/114. Incidentally, it's on the show notes page where you'll find a link to a free copy of Karen's article, Bible King and Common Law, Genealogical Literacies and Family History Practices in British America. This is the article that Karen published in that 2012 edition of Early American Studies, an interdisciplinary journal. And Penn Press, the publisher of Early American Studies, has generously made Karen's article available to us for free so that you can further explore the history of genealogy in its early American context. So thank you so much for that, Penn Press. The Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture supports the study of early American history in all its rich, complex, and nuanced forms through its publications, conferences, and programs. Conferences, publications, and programs that you could read and participate in. To find out more about the Omohundro Institute and its work, visit benfranklinsworld.com/doinghistory or click the link in your Ben Franklin's World app. Although this is the last Tuesday of 2016, this isn't actually the last episode in the Doing History, How Historians Work series. Stay tuned this Friday, December 30th, for a special bonus episode, which will conclude this series by offering you a conversation not only with a fantastic historian, but one who runs a national museum that you requested to hear about. Intrigued? You should be, because it's the finale, which means it's going to be big and spectacular. Finally, do you have any family heirlooms or artifacts at home that tell you about your family's history and how your family has practiced genealogy over time? I'd love to hear about them, so if you do, send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook. And I promise, if you tell me about your family heirlooms and artifacts, I'll tell you about mine.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.